As the month of January 1649 draws to a close, the future of England hangs in the balance.
Something momentous is unfolding. For the last 2 days, the King of England has been publicly on trial, accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England.
But Charles is refusing to plead. Without a plea, the very legitimacy of the trial hangs by a thread. And so do both Charles's life and the future of the monarchy. This confrontation comes after 7 years of civil war that has divided towns, friends, and even families.
There is nothing civil about civil war. They have seen so much suffering and death and destruction. They've just had enough.
I'm historian Lisa Hilton, and over 3 episodes, I'm tracing, day by day, hour by hour, the 5 weeks that led to one of the most seismic moments in our constitutional history: the trial and death of King Charles I.
No king in England had ever been put on trial for any charge, let alone treason. It was unprecedented.
How did the nation effect this radical step, the reverberations of which are still felt, even to this day?
What they did do changed English law and politics forever.
Hidden within these weeks are the chance events, secret manipulations, and revolutionary actions that led to this ultimate decision.
How did a country kill its king?
It's the 23rd of January 1649, the 3rd day of Charles I's trial, and so far, it has been nothing short of disastrous. In Westminster's Great Hall, Oliver Cromwell and the commissioners once again confront the king.
He is the divinely appointed monarch, and therefore he's absolutely not going to play ball and give them any sense of the authority that they're claiming. Are they really going to kill a king? He's waiting and watching and expecting in this battle of nerve that they will crumble first.
Afraid the trial may collapse if the king won't plead, prosecutor John Cook gives Charles an ultimatum.
Cook tells the king that a refusal to plead will have the weight of a confession. This puts Charles in a tricky position. If he pleads to the charge, he acknowledges the legality of the court. If he remains silent, his guilt will be assumed.
To reiterate Cook's warning, the Chief Judge, John Bradshaw, offers Charles a final chance to admit to the charges or deny them. Sir, you are to give your positive and final answer in plain English, whether you are guilty or not guilty, to these treasons laid to your charge.
The king is morally culpable for so much that went wrong in the 17th century. That doesn't mean he was legally responsible for it.
The king is resolute. He will not legitimise proceedings with a plea. He replies, "For the charge I value it not a rush. It is the liberty of the people of England that I stand for. There is no law that allows you to make your king your prisoner."
When the king challenges the legality of the court, he's on a very firm legal basis. It gave him the moral high ground, it gave him the legal high ground. The members of the court didn't know how to respond. Charles said, "Show me the authorities, show me the law." And of course they couldn't show them because it didn't exist.
Bradshaw has been walking a legal tightrope, politely trying to persuade Charles to acknowledge the court. But after 3 days, his patience snaps.
Bradshaw is visibly irritated. He says, this is the third time you've refused to enter a plea. This is the third time you have impugned the court. And he says, you claim to be looking out for the people, to be protecting their liberties, but actions speak louder than words. And he then goes on to say that you have written your meaning in bloody characters throughout the realm. He can't speak out without accepting the authority of the court.
Once again, the scales tip, this time in Parliament's favour. As night falls on the 23rd of January, Bradshaw, Cook and Cromwell resolve to prove the king is guilty as charged. It's the fourth day of the trial, and the prosecution have a new tactic. To convince the commissioners that Charles is a murderer, a man of blood. In order to lawfully condemn the king, the judges resolve that they need witness testimony against him, evidence that he is indeed a man of blood. So the High Court decides to call such witnesses. Calling witnesses is nothing new, but Parliament takes the extraordinary decision to halt the trial and hear 33 testimonies away from open court and away from the king.
The witness statements aren't needed. It's just for the commissioners, just to shore up their own beliefs in what they're doing. They were borrowing from several different legal areas, one of which, that in martial law trials, you take witness statements. It was something that Charles himself had used throughout the war. And so they were trying, in some way, the king by his own legal standards.
The words of these witnesses were transcribed and are now kept in the National Archives. Where did the prosecution find these witnesses?
As far as we can tell, they're mostly drawn from the parliamentarian army itself.
Do you think it would be reasonable to say that the commissioners said, OK, we're going to charge him with this, go and find me a man in the X regiment who can corroborate it?
Yes. If we take this chap, William Brain, he's very much a committed parliamentarian. William is present when the King's Standard is raised at Nottingham.
So this act, the raising of the Royal Standard, that was crucial to the case that the prosecutors were bringing?
Yes, it's really showing that Charles has personally initiated this conflict and therefore that he is a traitor because he's waged war against his own people, and it's the people who are sovereign, not the king. One of the tantalising witness statements is from Thomas Rawlins. Rawlins says that the royalist forces at Foy in Cornwall plunder the civilians, even though the king is very close by. He does nothing to stop this. But in fact, we know that the king ordered that those royalist plunderers should be executed. So he doesn't, ignore what's going on at all. When he's alerted to it, he takes very swift and very severe action against that breach of the laws of war.
It's difficult to feel that these witness statements are anything other than extraordinarily biased. Would you agree?
I think, yes, we can see that some of the witnesses, we can imagine were kind of being pressed to give this evidence. We know from the testimony of one of the witnesses, Samuel Burden, he says he was commanded to give evidence by his officer. So he says he was pretty much coerced. One of the really powerful things about witnesses is that personal experience.
Yes, they're real.
And that you're hearing from real people who have suffered, and those real people need justice.
With each passing day, Charles's control over the trial is waning, and the outcome seems increasingly inevitable. The trial is paused for another day as the court hear more witnesses speak out against the king.
What the witnesses are stating they saw are events that no one doubts happened. He can't deny the fact that he was a part of the war, and therefore he was the author, occasioner of all of these sufferings. He's guilty of it all.
Cromwell's tactic has paid off. After the witnesses have delivered their testimony, 69 out of 135 commissioners at last conclude there is enough evidence to convict the king. Tomorrow, they will sit to decide Charles's fate. It's the 6th day of the trial. Once again, Cromwell and the commissioners gather to consider the case against the king. Once again, the king is absent. A draft of the final charge is read out. Amendments are made and agreed. The final charge concludes that Charles can be convicted of treasonous crimes against the people. The penalty for treason is death.
They defined treason as a breach of the rights of the English people. He had slaughtered people, killed people. He'd used his power to abuse others.
But the commissioners also agree that if the king will finally acknowledge the authority of the court, they'll adjourn and consider what's to be done. Tomorrow will be the king's last chance to comply. It's the 27th of January and the final day of the trial of Charles I. It's the culmination of not only the trial, but 7 years of civil war and seemingly endless negotiations. In the Great Hall of Westminster, there's a huge crowd waiting to see what fate will befall their king. Some shout justice, others execution. As Charles takes his seat here, he looks over at John Bradshaw, the Lord President of this High Court of Justice. Bradshaw is robed in red, traditionally worn only for ceremonial occasions or criminal cases. This is the riskiest moment in English legal history. If sentencing goes wrong, the tables could turn, and charges of treason could be levelled at Charles's accusers instead of at the king. History is being made, and the setting and ceremony reflect the gravity of the day. As Bradshaw opens the proceedings, he takes a momentous decision. He declares that Charles's refusal to plead must now be taken as a confession. Finally, Charles is allowed to speak, and the court scribe records his words. He says that he wishes to delay the ugly sentence I believe will be passed on me, for such hasty sentences once passed are sooner repented of than recalled. He speaks of his desire for the peace of the kingdom.
He says he wants his word to be heard in front of the Lords and the Commons. So once again, he's impugning the validity of the court. While Bradshaw is telling Charles that he can't be heard, there's a commotion behind him, and one of the commissioners, the MP for Arundel, John Downes, stands up and shouts, "Have we hearts of stone? Are we men?" And Cromwell, who's right in front of him, sort of turns around and says, "Are you mad? What ails you?" And basically says, sit down, and Downes says he won't.
The court descends into chaos. Any compassion for the king threatens to destroy these fragile proceedings. Once again, Bradshaw addresses the king, telling him that he will not be heard by the Lords and Commons, but they will proceed straight to sentencing. Once again, the king begs to be heard, claiming that he has a new plan for the peace of the kingdom.
He tries to cut a deal, and the only deal they might accept is if he were prepared to abdicate, be sent off in exile to the West Indies or somewhere. In fact, the commissioners who see him now as a vengeful monarch who can't be trusted not to make war on them, decide to plough ahead.
Bradshaw cuts the king short and begins a 40-minute oration in which he will sum up the case against Charles.
Bradshaw wants to prove that Charles is below the law. To do that, He quotes from the Bible, he relies on classical examples like Caligula and Nero, and he claims that Parliament are acting in the same way that the barons did when fighting King John before writing Magna Carta. It was Parliament's duty to step in and defend the English constitution against any tyrannical king.
But the heart of Bradshaw's argument against the king rests on an event that had taken place just a few hundred metres away in Westminster Abbey in 1626. Since William the Conqueror, all but 2 of the English monarchs have been crowned here, and Charles is no exception.
At the climax of the ceremony, Charles undertook the solemn coronation oath, in which he was asked to promise to keep the peace to God, the Holy Church, the clergy, and the people. "I will," he responded. He was then asked to uphold the laws and rightful customs which the commonalty of this your kingdom have. Again, he promised to do so. Now, in Westminster Hall, Bradshaw is arguing that the king has broken this sacred oath.
The coronation oath was a bond between the king and the people. I think he was probably talking about something broader and more contractual. The king and the people have an agreement with each other. And if one of them breaks the terms of those agreements by oppressing the other, then the bond's broken.
It's a brilliant move, because this same oath has been at the very heart of Charles's defence. Charles believes that he was born to be king, and he only answers to God. For him, the coronation was the confirmation of this. It's a low blow, but a blinding one.
He is now conscious of justice, the momentum, if you like, of justice. He realizes that his tactic has not worked.
Bradshaw cleverly ends this stage of his oration saying, "Sir, if this bond be once broken, farewell sovereignty." The authority of a ruler is only valid if he protects his subjects. The king has no defence against this.
And then he starts to panic. He's flailing, he's stuttering. I think he suddenly realizes the penny is suddenly dropping, that they're going to do this.
Bradshaw then commands the clerk to read the sentence. Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body.
They really are going to chop off his head. He's desperate then to speak, to say his piece, to put forward his argument.
And Charles says, "But I'm the king. Of course I can speak."
But in English law, a condemned man is already dead, and a dead man can't speak.
As the last words ring out across the hall, the commissioners rise to their feet to signify their assent.
69 commissioners stand in agreement of the judgment, showing that they support the judgment. It's not Bradshaw's judgment, it's all of their judgments.
Bradshaw dismisses Charles Stuart and orders the guards to take him away.
England has killed kings before. If one thinks of Richard II, if one thinks of Henry VI, it's done it before. But this has been done by people who are usurping that power. There's never been a kind of judicial sense. It is an enormous leap to make when he's going against God's will.
By giving judgment, their aim and what they did do changed English law and politics forever. They had attempted to shatter and remove the idea of a divine right of kings and to warn every single governor and every ruler that they were always to be held to account by the people.
Charles is carried by sedan chair from Westminster Hall to Whitehall Palace. Troops line the route, but curious crowds jostle to catch a glimpse of their fallen king.
Londoners are shocked, and people are sort of weeping at windows and so forth. Parliament and the new model army are anxious, very anxious about what's going to happen next.
In Whitehall Palace, Charles asks his gentleman of the bedchamber, Thomas Herbert, to remove his much-loved dogs. He wishes to spend whatever time he has left preparing to meet his God.
How long Charles will live is now firmly in the hands of Cromwell and the commissioners. A committee is hastily formed to decide on the place and time of the king's execution.
In the last 24 hours, the Parliament of England has changed the world. Since time immemorial, the king has been the cornerstone of English government, law and justice. Now, he has been sentenced to death. As dawn breaks on the Sabbath, there's a chance for the drama of the day before to sink in.
There was a real sense of incredulity and, of course, also unease. You know, if you kill the king, the world really has been turned upside down.
Under the Puritan regime, Sunday is strictly a day of rest. And as Cromwell and the commissioners are all good Puritans, any plans for the king's execution must be put on hold for the day. But there's no rest for those guarding the king. In the afternoon, they moved Charles from Whitehall to St James's Palace.
These carefully choreographed moves are just trying to mitigate the risk of some kind of escape attempt, just to keep Charles under as strict guard as is possible and away from people who might seek to try and rescue him.
The last known portrait of Charles I, painted by Edward Bower, now hangs here in St James's Palace. Bower probably made studies of the king during his trial and then worked the portrait up afterwards in the studio. He shows the red velvet chair on which the king sat, the hat, which he never removed, and the Order of the Garter hung about his neck. I'm really intrigued by the king's hands. We know that Charles was small and undersized as a child, so it could be that this is simply an accurate rather than a flattering representation. And yet they seem so small, so pale, and so weak. Is there something critical here? Is it suggesting that these are not the hands of a man who's capable of wielding power? I've never seen Charles looking less magnificent or more human. Although the picture was probably commissioned by one of his opponents, it's not hostile. It has a kind of ambiguous tenderness to it. The king's face looks weary, he's aged, his beard is grey, he looks tired, but at the same time there's a kind of serenity, or is it resignation? Some courtiers ask to see Charles, but he sends them away. He does, however, accept a messenger delivering a letter from his son, the Prince of Wales. This letter must have been written before sentence was passed. Charles, Prince of Wales, was in Holland, and even in the best circumstances, news took time to spread so far. The prince recalls that he's had no news of his father beyond rumour and printed news sheets. He ends with the words, "I do pray for your majesty, not only according to my duty, but shall always do all that shall be in my power to deserve the blessing I now humbly beg of your majesty." Perhaps it was better that he wrote those words before he learned the full, dire truth of his father's circumstances. Believing he can still save his father, Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, initiates the only foreign intervention made on the king's behalf. He persuades 2 Dutch ambassadors to go to London.
Prince Charles is trying to do whatever he can to plead for his father's life, to find a way of freeing his father. But I mean, these are vain efforts. They are really not going to undo the chain of events. Really, the die has been cast.
Unaware of this attempt to save his life, Charles is instead preparing for the next life with the Bishop of London, William Juxon.
And he spent his days praying, making his peace with God. And of course, it was God who he saw that he was ultimately accountable only to God. A person who really had been marked by insecurity for much of his life. But at this moment of great trial, it seemed that he finds this inner strength. And I think that came through his hours of prayer.
The Sabbath is over, and for Cromwell and the commissioners, there's urgent work to be done. In order to authorise the execution of Charles I, they must sign his death warrant.
A death warrant means that the people that take part in the execution are not in themselves culpable because they are acting lawfully. The person has been condemned to death, and this warrants his execution.
It may be lawful, but the commissioners are rightly fearful of adding their names to the regicide.
Regicide is the Latin term for killing a king. You are doing something that has never been done before. You were killing the Lord's anointed. To do that, you had to be very sure of what you were doing, but most people would be absolutely taken aback by it. It was unprecedented.
In order legally to authorise the execution, Cromwell requires at least 20 names on the death warrant. While he's trying to round up signatures, Parliament agrees to hear the Dutch mission. First, the Dutch ambassadors come to the House of Lords, where they plead for the King's life. They're told that the Lords can do nothing without the Commons. So next they're received by the Commons, where the MPs fall back on procedure. They assure the ambassadors that they will give proper consideration to the plea, but only after it's been translated. Although the time of the execution has not yet been made public, the rumour is it will happen tomorrow. The Commons are playing for time. Just along from Whitehall, at St James's Palace, Charles is under heavy guard.
He asks Thomas Herbert to go and fetch a few trinkets that he has stored, a few broken trinkets, a couple of Orders of the Garter, for example. And he says to Thomas Herbert, "Look, this is all the wealth I have left to give my children."
This exquisite portrait miniature shows the middle children of Charles I. James, Duke of York, who was in France in 1649, Princess Elizabeth, and Henry, Duke of Gloucester. It was commissioned while the children were in the care or custody of the Earl of Northumberland, but although he was a parliamentarian, the Earl seems to have grown fond of his royal charges. Since Charles's arrest 2 years ago, he hasn't been allowed to see his 5 surviving children, 3 of whom are living in Europe. Parliament grants him permission to see his 2 youngest, 13-year-old Elizabeth and 8-year-old Henry. Elizabeth left this account of her last meeting with her father. She was known as a serious and scholarly young woman, but she was so beside herself with tears that Charles feared that she'd forget everything that he told her. She promised him that she would write it down. And this is what she recorded. "He commanded us and all the rest of my brothers and sisters to forgive them. He bid me tell my mother that his thoughts had never strayed from her and that his love should be the same to the last." The king went on to try and comfort his daughter, who, like him, was very devout, saying that she shouldn't grieve for him because he went to die a martyr. And then, in what I think is the most heartbreaking moment in Elizabeth's description, he takes Henry, Duke of Gloucester, on his knee. Henry's only 8 years old. He hasn't seen his father for years. And the king explains, "Sweetheart, now they are to cut off thy father's head." He then explained to Henry that he should never, never accept a crown from the army, certainly at least not while his brothers James and Charles were living. And Henry, trying desperately to be brave, assured his father that he would rather be torn in pieces first. A grief-stricken Charles presents his children with his few remaining jewels and trinkets. He kisses them, blesses them, and says goodbye.
They start to leave, and Elizabeth is crying so hard, many of the soldiers and things in the room have overcome, and Charles himself, who's standing by a window at that stage, rushes back to them and embraces them again. It's only then that they leave, and at that point Charles is overcome.
We've seen Charles in this story as the aloof, arrogant monarch. We've seen him as a pious prisoner, a contemptuous sovereign in the dock. But here, for the first time, we see him in the raw, stripped of everything but his love for his children, a desperate father saying farewell to his family, all of them in tears, all of them knowing that they're never going to meet again. Charles's despair will only be compounded by those consenting to his regicide. By evening, Cromwell has far exceeded the minimum number of 20 names on the death warrant. 59 commissioners have signed it.
Even now, some of the commissioners can't quite bring themselves to sign it. So you have 9 who don't sign it. And I think the silence of their non-signatures speaks volumes about what a radical thing this really is.
For Cromwell, signing the death warrant is the only legitimate course of action. He believes it's God's will. Others, aware they may be in mortal peril, later suggest Cromwell has coerced them.
I think we have to be very careful about these. One of them, Richard Inglesby, says that he was physically dragged to the table and Cromwell held his hand and forced him to sign. But this is much later. This is at the time of the Restoration. And he's trying to point the finger of blame at Cromwell. But if you look at his signature, it doesn't look like a signature that's been forced.
The death warrant of King Charles I must be one of the most famous parliamentary manuscripts in England. It's kept in the parliamentary archives, but is considered so precious that it can no longer be taken out of storage to be studied. This, though, is an exact copy.
It's usually displayed in the House of Lords, perhaps as a reminder of what happens when parliamentary sovereignty is challenged. The text itself is fairly brief. It merely outlines that Charles was sentenced upon Saturday last and reiterates the manner of his death, the severing of his head from his body. Here it states unequivocally the place, a street in Whitehall, and the time, between 10 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. And then here are the signatures. First the Lord President, Bradshaw, and then O. Cromwell.
Each signatory stamps their personal seal on the death warrant, each signing away the King's life.
What strikes me about this document is its bluntness. It's toppling an ancient, mystical institution in just a few curt words. Here they are, in black and white. The King will die.
By signing the death warrant of the King, the signatories knew that should things go pear-shaped and should a monarchical regime come in at some time in the future, what they had done under the Act of 1351 was compass the death of the King. They were clearly guilty of treason.
Once the death warrant has been signed, it is something of a race against the clock to get the King executed. And I think people are scared.
The longer that Charles was around, the more chance he has to escape, the more chance they have for further riots, further rebellions, further uprisings, more civil war, more destruction. They needed him gone.
As night falls, workers are busy erecting a scaffold. Tomorrow, it will be the stage for the final scene in this shocking political theatre. It's the 30th of January, the date set for the King's execution. In the turmoil of the last few days, Parliament have forgotten one crucial piece of legislation.
They've forgotten that if the King dies, then long live the King will be shouted.
It is one of the extraordinary things that it was only on the morning of the execution that Parliament had to pass an act that made it a criminal offence, in fact treason, to promulgate the name of a successor to Charles I. In other words, if anyone were to name Charles II king, they would be a traitor.
As the clock ticks, Parliament rushes to decide whether or not they should be killing both the monarch and the monarchy. Unaware of a possible revolutionary shift towards a republic, Charles resolves to remain regal for the future prosperity of the crown.
He's very wary of being seen to be scared. He knows that it's crucial that he continues this sense of kingly authority right to the end.
On this freezing winter's morning, Charles asks to wear 2 shirts.
He doesn't want to shiver and give the impression that he's frightened. So he layers up and he prepares to stay strong, to stay courageous.
Charles spends the early morning praying with the bishop. He then receives the final sacrament. At 10 a.m. comes the knock on the door. Charles's watch captures that exact moment in time. It's held in the royal collection.
Charles had 2 timepieces, one gold and this silver one. Herbert records in his memoirs that Charles used to wind them every night. When Charles heard the knock at the door on that fateful morning, he said one more prayer with Bishop Juxon, then turned to him and said, "Come, let us go." Herbert followed them, carrying this watch. As they left the palace, Charles asked him the time. Herbert replied that it was 10 o'clock, and Charles told him to keep the watch in memory of him.
Charles is surrounded by guards. Once, his every journey through his capital would have been choreographed with ceremony and comfort in mind. Today, however, he's on foot.
It's about a 10-minute walk between St James's Palace and Whitehall. The morning of the 30th of January is freezing cold, and Charles asked to quicken the slow, solemn pace.
The guards march Charles to Whitehall Palace, where he will wait to be summoned to the scaffold outside Banqueting House. Once the site of opulent masked balls, it will now play host to a very different spectacle.
Banqueting House is chosen for security. It's where the army is headquartered. They're all around Whitehall. It's even got a battery of guns on the roof, so it's perfect.
I think it's because it's a confined space. It limits the size of the crowd, and they're pushed well back. They don't want people hearing whatever it is that Charles has to say.
So who's going to do it? Who is actually going to kill the king? The obvious choice is Richard Brandon, the city executioner.
Undoubtedly, it was Brandon, the normal executioner, because he did a very good job.
Brandon has already beheaded the Earl of Strafford, and he prides himself on his dexterity, eye, and steady hand. The axe, rumoured to have been sharpened by Brandon himself, is held in the Tower of London.
So, for sheer brutality and functionality, this object really can't be beaten. Can you tell me a bit more about it, Bridget?
Yes, it's traditionally the executioner's axe at the Tower of London. It's called a socket axe because it has that tube that runs up the back.
Oh, I can see that here, yeah? And do we have any evidence that an axe like this left the tower at the time of the trial?
We do. There is a warrant saying that the executioner's axe is to be delivered to the sergeant of the court.
So it's possible that this axe could really have been the one that we used to behead Charles I?
Could have been. We don't know exactly.
And would this have been capable of dealing a very clean blow?
Yes, if it's been sharpened, a good headsman should be able to use the axe well, and if he's been practicing, because quite often executioners did not have enough practice in some ways. And certainly part of the myth of Richard Brandon was that he was supposed to have practiced as a child on cats and dogs.
There was a degree of deliberate ambiguity around the identity of the headsman.
Yes.
Why was that?
I suspect it was for his own protection, because people didn't know how everybody was going to react. And they were doing something that nobody had really done before. It was an unprecedented event. And I suspect that sense would say that you don't proclaim that's what you've done when you don't know how popular it's going to be having done it.
As Brandon prepares the axe, the Dutch ambassadors make one last attempt to save the king's life. They visit the head of the army, Sir Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax has been steadfastly against any form of regicide, but now he concedes the king should face the executioner. He tells the ambassadors he would rather protect many lives than one, even if it's the king's. A few hundred yards away, Parliament are not only on the verge of killing the king, they're debating last-minute legislation that could also ensure the death of the monarchy itself. The House of Commons Journal notes this urgent bill presented on the 30th of January. Here we can see the title under discussion, Concerning the Proclaiming of a King. Emergency legislation is being rushed through the Commons, saying that no one can be proclaimed king without the consent of Parliament. The bill is given its first and second reading, and then the House adjourn at midday for dinner. When they return, the bill is put to the question and assented unto. This must be one of the fastest bits of legislation that's ever passed through Parliament. No time to read the bill, just sign it.
It is just an extraordinary thing that they rushed this legislation through minutes before the blade was going to chop the king's head off. It's often said, well, they've forgotten about it. Had they really forgotten about it? Or was it that they actually hadn't made up their mind until as late as that actually it's not just the monarch who must go, it's the monarchy.
Unaware of these desperate manoeuvres, the king has been waiting at Banqueting House. His intention has been for only the sacrament to pass his lips, but as the agonising hours crawl by, Bishop Juxon persuades him to take a little bread and claret. Just before 2 p.m, Charles begins his final journey to the executioner's block. So Charles walks through here on his way to the scaffold. His eyes must have been drawn to the ceiling, to the masterpiece he himself had commissioned the Flemish artist Rubens to paint. It shows the apotheosis of his father, King James, the king's elevation to divine status. Charles's troubles had largely stemmed from his own belief in his divine kingship, and now he believes that he's on the way to meet his God, his own apotheosis. How does this extravagant, intoxicating image of power seem to him now, this last time? Hubris or vindication?
It must have been quite moving, because this is where the Stuart monarchy is most exalted. And even in the gloom, he can look up and he will see that magnificent Rubens painting, the apotheosis of James I. There's this father in the heavens, and yet he, Charles, is very much on the ground and about to place his head on the block.
Charles is guided to the window from where he steps onto the specially built scaffold. As he looks out, he sees a huge crowd held back by troops. Charles sees the block where he'll soon lay his head.
The block is really low. It's only about 10 inches high. And this troubles him. You know, he's going to have to lie down, but he's told that they can't have a higher block now.
He can see his executioner and the executioner's assistant. In the contemporary images I've seen show them are wearing fishnet. So you can imagine what a macabre sight this must have been, seeing the man who's ever going to kill you and the man who's going to lift up your decapitated head with their features distorted by fishnet.
They were a bit worried that Brandon might quail at the last minute. So his assistant was clearly an army loyalist.
Charles reaches into his pocket for a piece of paper. Clerks in the crowd take down every word so that the King's last speech can be published for all to read. Charles begins by stating his innocence. He says, "I do not think it needful for me to insist long upon this, for all the world knows that I did not begin a war first with the two Houses of Parliament." After days of refusing to plead, this is his moment to say, "not guilty."
Charles maintains his innocence once again. He says it wasn't him who started the war, it was Parliament. He says he has always been trying to defend the liberties and privileges of the people. And then he says that famous line, "A subject and a sovereign are clean different things."
The King is gracious towards his enemies, declaring that he has forgiven all the world, and even in particular those that have been the chief causes of my death. He hopes that they will take the right way towards the peace of the kingdom. The King's speech is interrupted when one of the executioners accidentally bumps against the axe. "Hurt not the axe that may hurt me," Charles quips. A bit of gallows humour.
He's worried about the axe because he wants to die with dignity. He wants it to be a clean kill. He doesn't want a blunt axe. The execution of his grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a fairly messy affair.
Charles turns his thoughts to the people. "Truly, I desire their liberty and freedom as much as anybody whosoever." He says that he's only on the scaffold because he tried to protect the people from having all laws changed according to the power of the sword. "Therefore, I tell you, I am the martyr of the people."
Charles's speech is a speech of huge courage. These are the words that will pave the way, potentially, for his son to succeed him. These are the words that are going to echo through the years, that are going to be his response to the unprecedented act of killing a king, timed to play to the crowd, and it seems to get their sympathy and their respect, even at this moment of humiliation.
He acts very much like a Christ-like figure, changing the views of those who read it from thinking that he was potentially a tyrant or some kind of murky monarch or difficult figure to being a martyr who died for his principles in an unjust and unfair trial.
Cromwell is absent during this whole performance.
Where's Cromwell? Good question. Where's Cromwell? I mean, once again, he is just out of the frame. He's definitely around, sitting, watching, waiting.
He hands his garter to the Bishop of London, Juxon, with its George. That is the figure of St. George killing the dragon of rebellion with 412 diamonds, so they're sort of sparkling, you can imagine, in the kind of winter light. He wants the bishop to give the garter to his son, Prince Charles, because he will now have to carry on the war. But he just says to the bishop, as he hands it over, he just says, "Remember."
Charles confers with the executioner and says that he will pray briefly and then sign for him to strike. Bishop Juxon gives the final blessing, to which Charles Stuart, King of England, utters, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world."
There's a macabre moment right at the end when Charles is lying down and the executioner bends down and he's just making sure that the hair's out of the way. And Charles says, "Wait for the sign, wait for my sign." And the executioner says that he will, and he gets up. And Charles composes himself, and then he stretches out his hands. And then the axe falls.
So the axe has fallen. Charles's head is raised with the usual words, "Behold the head of a traitor."
A 17-year-old boy is among the watching crowds. Later, he will write that he would never forget that day, nor the sound that was drawn from the people as long as he lived. Such a groan as I never heard, and do desire never to hear again.
Some people were certainly stunned. It was a very shocking moment. Others, however, reacted differently. The soldiers on the scaffold were already thinking about the money they could make. They were poking at the scaffold, trying to dig up splinters of wood covered in blood so they could sell them as relics or mementos. They were cutting bits of his hair, chopping bits of his hair, so that they could sell that as well.
It's not just the soldiers who are keen to grab a grisly relic.
There's a surge, and a lot of people run forward. They try to dip their hankies in his blood. This is, the stuff of martyrs and saints. Relics seem to have sort of supernatural properties, a sort of holy radioactivity. They're seen to sort of cure the sick. The lame can walk, the blind can see. And there is one story that a wild lion in the zoo at the Tower of London is tamed by the sight of a blood-dipped piece of material from the covering over Charles's dead body.
Some of Charles I's relics are now part of the Portland collection in Derbyshire.
So these are hugely potent objects. Tell me some more about them.
The first one is the earring that would have been worn by Charles and was actually taken from the king's head after he'd been decapitated.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty gruesome.
It's quite a beautiful thing, but it's extraordinarily macabre.
After its removal, it was given to the king's daughter and made its way to the king's granddaughter, Mary II.
One hopes they gave it a wash first. And this?
So this is a silver communion cup. He reportedly had his last communion using this cup.
They also have the quality of saintly relics.
Yeah, so you think the idea of having something that once belonged to a venerated figure, whoever they are and whenever they lived, when we see it today, is something that has got a universal appeal.
Charles and his relics may have been gaining popularity after his death, but for the moment at least there seems little chance of a royalist return. The new republic orders Charles's head to be sewn back on his body and his corpse put on public display. Stark proof of the death of both monarch and monarchy.
Indeed, when Cromwell looked over the body of the king, he said, "Cruel necessity." And by cruel necessity, what he meant was, this is God's will. There was no alternative.
It's the 8th of February, 1649, and Charles Stuart is laid to rest in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Once his royal palace, then his prison, it's now his final resting place. There's no fuss, and barely a service. But on the same day in London, books roll off the printing presses. A publication that parliamentarians can no longer suppress. The Icon Basilica, or the Royal Portrait. The icon is likely to have been compiled using a selection of the King's writings. A number of copies are now kept here at the Wren Library in Cambridge.
This little book, destroyed at the publishers in the run-up to the King's trial, is finally printed. It has not been passed by the censor, and it bears no publisher's name. Inside, the subtitle explains that it is the portraiture of His Sacred Majesty in his solitudes and sufferings. Immediately, the royalists accept this as Charles's own words.
It depicts Charles very sympathetically as a devout, holy, suffering man, who loves his people. This is the passion of Charles I, and it turns him into a martyr.
And look at this. Icon, 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 icon. In the year following the King's death, the icon was reprinted more than 30 times. The Royalists now have a powerful weapon for their cause, a martyred king. For Cromwell and his party, the work is just beginning. They must reunite a war-torn country and rule it as a republic. Charles was killed on the 30th of January, 1649, but the ideal and the threat of kingship still live on. So did Charles have to die in order to save both kingship and the kingdom?
From the parliamentary point of view, yes, I think he probably did have to die for the pacification of the kingdom. From his point of view, he had to die for the preservation of the monarchy.
Was Charles a murderer? He didn't murder anyone in cold blood, but he had blood on his hands. Was he a martyr? Maybe. He is a saint, the only saint of the Anglican Church. He might have been a martyr for the monarchy, but was he a martyr for the liberties and privileges of the people? I think that's a stretch even for Charles.
Charles I's trial and subsequent death moved us from absolute kingship to make way for modern governments. And it set a radical precedent for the judiciary, not only in Britain, but across the globe.
When looking around for precedents for Nuremberg, for prosecuting Saddam Hussein and Milosevic and Pinochet, one goes back to this as the beginning of denying impunity to despots and to rulers who kill their own people.
Charles could have compromised very slightly and saved his own personal monarchy. But in a way, I think he had a martyr's complex. And who's to argue against Charles's providential worldview? Because in the end, it's the monarchy that returned.
As the axe fell, it crushed centuries of royal rule, making way for parliamentary democracy and ensuring that no one is above the law, not even a king. For the present in England, the death of Charles I means the death of monarchy. The country will be ruled as a republic, left in the hands of the men who claim to represent the people. Will they be able to heal a country ravaged by years of civil wars and destruction? Or will they encounter the same pitfalls as the king they have executed? If the republic fails, the 59 men who signed the king's death warrant will be in mortal danger, themselves accused of treason. The stage is set for the revenge of the king.